A look at the challenges for women working in sports media through the decades. Next on a special edition of Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Mark Rosenwig, Associate Professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. It's been more than 35 years since the first woman was admitted to a Major League Baseball locker room, but the drive for equality for women working in sports media continues. A 2006 survey showed women comprised only 11% of those working in sports media. So what's the status of women in sports media today? We explored that question and looked at the decades of difficulties for women during a discussion at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center on the Montclair State campus. Our panel included Annie Sundberg, who directed the film Let Them Wear Towels, on the early experiences of women in sports media for the ESPN 9 for 9 series, and Tara Sullivan, sports reporter and columnist for The Record. I asked Tara Sullivan for her assessment on the status of working women in sports media today.
I like to think that I'm encouraged. I feel like when I've been in this business for over 20 years, and I do see more women, younger women coming out of college or in the classroom or looking to enter the workforce. The odd part for me is sort of figuring out where to fit these days, because the industry has changed so much, where the traditional path when I started was a newspaper, maybe a local TV station. Things have changed a lot. Newspapers are so different. They're not hiring as many people, but there are websites and there are different things. So I'd like to be encouraged. I can't say, I even noticed it last night. I happened to cover the Nets game, and the crowd of us coming off the court after the game and into the interview area where the coach always does the immediate post-game interview. And I just did notice that I think there was one other woman in the crowd, and I thought, oh, I'd like to see more. So sometimes I'm encouraged because I see younger faces coming in, but on the whole, I'm still far outnumbered.
Annie, what's your view, having done this film, all this research, talked to so-called pioneers on the beat?
Well, one thing that we had made a film prior to making Let Them Wear Towels, which was our own experience as sort of women sports reporters, called Knuckleball, which followed R.A. Dickey and Tim Wakefield and Phil Negro and Charlie Huff. And that was interesting because, to your point, we were the only women in the locker rooms. We were the only women in the press conferences. You go down for spring training, every beat reporter is a guy, and it was kind of remarkable. And I thought, it can't be that there aren't baseball fans. It's not a gender-specific sport, in terms of loving it, appreciating it, and being able to write about it. And that was what was so interesting then when we made Let Them Wear Towels, is that, Leslie Visser, who was one of the early, she did so much with NFL. There was this article that was published around the time that these women were starting to do their reporting, and I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of the Boston Globe writer. It was, is the lady serious? And the challenge was, do you remember this one?
No, but the headline is enough to make me.
It was Lori,
what was his last name?
It was written by a man, it was written by an editor, and I can't believe I'm blanking on this name, because Leslie Visser wrote a very cheeky response to it, which is, you're right, is the lady serious? Of course we are. We're reporters, we're covering this just as the male reporters are, and yet it's incredible, the gender disparity. You just don't see women reporters on sports beats.
And I was going to say, too, to that point, I am actually a little skewed by working and living in this market, because the number of media outlets we have in the New York, New Jersey market, if you guys live here and pay attention to that, you are aware of that. Trust me, I might go to St. Louis to cover a game, and there's one newspaper. It's the biggest difference athletes will tell you when they come here to play, is just the sheer number of media people. So I think in this market, we're a little bit better represented, the number of women, but the more you go to other cities and other places and other people's spring training camps, I'm often taken aback as a visiting journalist how few women are in other places.
And I think the one thing that I also noted when we made Let Them Wear Towels is that all of the women that we interviewed had incredibly supportive undergraduate experiences. They had an amazing experience either as the sports editor of their papers, they were often covering Division III teams, so they felt that they were basically doing semi-pro reporting, and then all of a sudden they left the collegiate or university environment and they got out into the real world, and all of a sudden they were on a different footing again. And so, in some ways the industry hadn't caught up with the academic environment, and that was very frustrating for people to make that transition.
Yeah, because you're going out there expecting that it's going to operate the same way that it didn't, and it doesn't always. You don't want to be overly discouraging, but it is a reality check when you come out of this environment, which is kind of how we expect it to be. But it's true. That's the undergraduate experience can really, because I often say that being sports editor of the college paper as I was. We even said it to ourselves at the time, it's the best job you'll ever have. You have so much autonomy and that kind of thing. But
and I just want to say that all of the reporters that I've met, both men and women, they report on sports because they love it. It's something that they're passionate about. They know the game. They understand it. A lot of the women say, and you probably saw this in the film, they were often writing about the personal stories. They become very, and I hate to play. It's funny because when we were doing this project for ESPN. They focused on two things in particular. They focused on the moment of access inside the locker room because that to them was a flashpoint issue. And they also wanted us to really explore, did gender impact the reporting? Like, did it result in different stories and different, and every time we pushed that with the women reporters that we were interviewing, they all backed away. They all said,
and I don't back away from that at all.
Interesting, well, because they said the locker room is like 2% of the job. Just, it doesn't matter where that takes place. It just happens to take place in the locker room. So we wanted equal access to be able to do our job. But those questions, they could have been asked in any other variety of forums, but we just needed to be there at the time.
Because other writers were there, to keep it equal.
So it wasn't like there was, they felt that in some ways was such a non-issue. Even though it was this sort of sexualized flashpoint at the time it happened. The other thing is they did feel that there's a lens that people were looking at women writers saying they're softer, they're more sort of personal interest, general interest stories. Sometimes that played better because they actually really took an interest in the players and how they developed and who their inspirations were, and they weren't just about the box scores and the numbers. So, but it's weird.
Well, my response to that has always been every writer who comes into a situation writes from what they know best. So for African American writers, they may connect to the people they're covering in a different way. I might connect. Sometimes it's not because I'm a woman, it's because I'm a parent, that I might connect with an athlete in a certain way. Sometimes it's because I was obsessed with pitching when I watched baseball, so I might start talking to a pitcher about that. I just think singling out, why does the fact that, the woman in that case likes to write more of the human interest is somehow softer, like you said, it's the perfect word. I just think every writer, when you come into a situation and you're interviewing people, you bring to the table what you care about.
Right.
And I know plenty of male writers who write great human interest pieces, and I know plenty of women writers who can break down, an offensive line formation or unit better than many of the guys I know. So I just think, for me, I love the human interest stuff. That's what I love to connect on. I call it my wheelhouse, and I don't back away from that at all. If that's because I'm a woman, so be it. That's what I bring to the table.
No, what I wanted to ask you about is, I find it interesting that you made the comment that when you interviewed the women for the film, that they were talking about the access to the, to the locker room only being a short portion of this. Does that mean that even though they got access, they're dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, or did you get into that with them? What's their view, do you think?
So sorry.
Yeah.
No, I think that it has less to do with satisfaction with current state. I think that people just got, I think that when we were making this film, we were charged with exploring that particular moment. What it was like to have a woman around men in a very private, male-dominated world, a men's locker room where people
that happens to include nudity.
Exactly. That men are in various stages of undress, everything else. In terms of feeling satisfied or less satisfied in terms of access, I think Melissa Ludke felt a certain satisfaction because that seminal case, which was brought against the Yankees, and which resulted in her being the first woman granted access inside a Major League Baseball locker room. Again, it was just for the Yankees, and it wasn't league-wide, but it started a ripple effect. I think she felt some satisfaction, because I think she felt satisfaction that other people were standing behind her to allow her to do the job that her colleagues were doing. That was where she felt satisfaction. In terms of the state of affairs now, I think that those access issues are over. I think the bigger issue, we talk with Leslie Visser and we talk with people like Robert Herman, is there's so much of the sports reporting now there's still a very vibrant print journalism culture, but a lot of what we're seeing is television. And there aren't a lot of women anchoring, in particular NFL. There aren't a lot of, there's sideline reporters, but there aren't a lot of anchors and play-by-play. And some people say that's not what we were in the game for. We wanted to write about the game itself and the sport. We didn't want to be behind a desk on camera. But
still, that's the access, the glass ceiling issue,
Right.
and that from the 70s, Gail Sierens is still the only woman who's ever done play-by-play
Right.
of a network NFL game.
Yep.
And her story is that she had, by that point, converted from a weekend sports anchor in Tampa to a news anchor, and her general manager came to her, even though NBC wanted her to do 6 more games, and said, you're either going to be our news anchor or you're going to go off and do sports for them, and they were only offering 6 games. P.S. though, she's still on the air as the lead news anchor in Tampa and has been hugely successful, but that might not have happened.
Right. I had to just follow up because it's important to say the access issue it's over. I mean, legally speaking, there is no issue, except there is still an issue. I was at the Masters only a few years ago, and I was stopped from going into the locker room because I was a woman by a female security guard, might I add. A contracted group of security people by the Masters organizers, and I think it was just her natural assumption that there was no way women were allowed in this part of Augusta National. Now, obviously, when the Masters is in play, there are a lot of factors at work. It wasn't just, it's not your typical sports event because of they had their longstanding policy of not having women members at Augusta National. It had sort of exacerbated that whole issue to begin with. So I think it was probably an easier leap for this person to say, well, there's no women allowed in here, so they can't even be reporters. And I literally did not get in the locker room that day. I didn't want to have a major meltdown and prevent colleagues of mine from doing their job. And I had many male colleagues step in and help me out and make sure that I got the interview that was done. It was Rory McIlroy was going into the locker room off the course. But it just, and I will say, the way my profession rose up in my defense was really heartening because I happened to tweet about it after it happened, and it sort of blew up, and the Masters organizers ended up apologizing to me and obviously made it clearer to the people that they hire. But and I thought that was one really good sign of progress because it was everybody in my profession, the males as well as the females, just saying like, this is ridiculous, she needs to get in there to do her job. But it still does happen.
I have to ask, in that circumstance, are the players supportive of your presence?
Well, yeah, now in this case, he had no idea. Like, Rory McIlroy was already in the locker room. I was trailing a large group, so by the time she stopped me, he would have had no idea. Listen, players, if they had their way, would have nobody in the locker room.
Right.
I mean, they can't stand that that's where things are done, but that's where things are done. So I will say my own experience has been good, and the younger the players get, the better the experience gets, because they've just grown up, watching Linda Cohn do Sports Center, or if it's not that, or their undergraduate experience likely included a female reporter somewhere along the way. So they're just less.
It's a process of a culture. It's like a cultural,
for sure. And some of them have no idea the battles that we had to fight as women, to get into that space. They just assume it's always been that way. But I had to at least point that one out. It's, as much as, yes, legally it's absolutely equal, but that doesn't always filter down to the practical application, unfortunately.
Yep.
How did you and Ricky decide on this topic? How did that all happen?
We were actually handed this topic. ESPN came to us with this series idea of 9 for 9, and the 30 by 30 series had been so wildly successful, but they were under fire for only having 1 or 2 filmmakers who were women. I think Barbara Koppel did the film about the house that George built, I think about Yankee Stadium and the rise of the Yankees. But they were feeling a little bit of heat to to acknowledge that there are women documentary filmmakers out there as well. So it was looking at Title IX through kind of a myriad perspective approach, and it was definitely, the topics were tricky because Ricky and I don't normally do essay films. We tend to do unfolding, character-driven journeys. That's sort of what we're known for. And so this was a little bit of telling a story in retrospect with very little archival material. Nobody had, I kept fantasizing that we were going to actually have, everyone had the dictaphones back in the day when they were, getting their pickups in the locker room.
Pointing at me like I remember that. I know what you mean, yes.
And we, and some people kept, some of their clippings, from press services, but most of the things that
It was just
it was just
recollections.
gone. And so you're dealing with past stories. So we went. John Walsh is an interesting guy who's obviously been at the helm of ESPN for years, and he really helped hire a lot of these young women sports reporters and really champion some of their careers. So he was very passionate about this project, and we sat with him, and he just downloaded lots of stories about people we should be looking at and people we should be approaching. And in the end, we needed to have a spread of perspective across the major sports. So there was football, baseball, hockey, and basketball. And it was interesting for us because we had never, we grew up in an era where we really felt like we had access. And the first time we brushed up against it a little bit was in making Knuckleball, but we had MLB behind us, so that was like a non-issue. I just remember being in a locker room once and some young player came out basically, whoa, there's a girl in here, and wrapped a towel around his waist. That was, that's
But you
all
had
we
such
ever
backing
had.
at that point, right? That's the indication as opposed to thinking of, I didn't really, there were groundbreakers ahead of me, thank goodness. So by the time I went into a locker room, I think I was probably more nervous because it was new, than
Right.
even the players were. I couldn't even imagine if it had turned like outwardly hostile as other women had to deal with, at least we're done with that part.
Although, as a man in the locker room, early in my career, I experienced a different type of hostility when you would ask a question or somebody didn't want to be bothered and
Yep.
so on. And don't we have, just across the board, not just gender specific now, an access problem?
Oh,
Tyra?
absolutely. Oh, I could go on
Yeah.
for days about how limited
Please do.
access is. Right? Even baseball, as an example, baseball, which has the strongest lobby from the writers' perspective, the Baseball Writers Association of America votes for the Hall of Fame, is a very strong group and has a good relationship with Major League Baseball to establish these rules. Baseball Clubhouse is open 3.5 hours before the game, and you can go in there until a half an hour before the game, and mill around and talk to guys. And
With the exception of the Red Sox, but yeah.
right, what do? They limit.
Nothing.
They just
Yeah.
limit it.
It's only post-game.
They don't open the locker room
No
before?
reporters in prior to game. You can be on the field, you can be everywhere else, but you can't actually be in the clubhouse.
Is that a space issue? Because Fenway Park
it's
is
a little bit of a
yeah,
space
Could be,
issue.
it's supposed to be.
But
yeah.
they've limited that. Like it used to be, okay, so you're in the locker room. Then the players go out for batting practice. If you had 2 reporters there, you could leave one in the locker room and one go on the field and watch batting practice. Now they don't allow that. Everybody's out. If the players are out, you can't stay in the locker room. Because it used to be like, players might still come in and out, so you might catch them on your own for a couple of minutes when they came in. And then after batting practice, there's still maybe another 20 minutes before they would close the locker room, in advance of the game. And that you used to be able to go back in then. They don't allow that anymore. So it's just so limited. On top of which, especially in these new stadiums, like the new Yankee Stadium as example, there's a locker room, but I'm telling you, it's not the real locker room. Like, it's like one for show. The guys have some stuff there, their uniforms, but they have another space in the back where they can really go and relax and hang out that we do not have access to. So you're lucky if you even find people at their lockers sometimes. And say as the NFL, by comparison, it's just these miniaturized windows. It's unbelievable. It might be 35 minutes in total that you get a day. And if you have 5 people you want to talk to, there's no guarantee they'll all be there in that window, or that you even have time, to speak to each of them. So I've seen it shrink amazingly in the years that I've been doing this job.
Really little one-on-one time. You're still talking about being in a group setting.
Absolutely.
And when they bring
And
them out after the
fighting to
game,
get-
it's like
yeah.
stand in front of the microphone and talk to 30
Yeah.
people, and that's it.
Well, a post-game situation has always been a tough spot to get a one-on-one. That's fine. You kind of expect that, and you don't necessarily fight for that after the game because it's a compressed window. But pre-game time, or say in the NFL during the week when they're just practicing, there should be time to get people one-on-one, and it's just everything is so compressed now and done in groups, and it's so unfortunate because you know, people from the outside might look at that and say, you get plenty, there's so many people there, everything gets transcribed, everything's on video, whatever you need you get, but it just removes that whole layer of personal interaction. And that to me, you know, I've had this discussion with many NFL coaches in particular who often resent the media's presence because they just feel like it takes away from their players' focus. And I try to explain, you know, we're part of the equation. Like, we are the conduit. We are you know, the bridge from those players to the fans comes through the media. At least it can. It's another way, and that's how I see my job, is to bring what I can get in here, go to a place where fans can't go, and bring that out. And the access is the only way I can do that. So it's frustrating, I have to say. It's a big issue.
Now, Annie, in all your research, the interviews with people like Leslie Visser and Melissa Ludke and so on, what were the most surprising things that came up that you didn't expect?
You know, to be honest, there wasn't a lot that we didn't expect, because you have a sense of how hard it was for women at that time. My sister, I have a sister who's 15 years older than I am, and so she kind of grew up in the same era that, you know, these women sports journalists did, where there were women breaking boundaries in a lot of ways in the early 70s. What I was surprised by is even someone, Leslie had in many ways sort of a golden path. Like, she came out of this incredibly rich Boston, you know, sports hub. She was nurtured by a lot of the top sports editors. You know, she calls it Murderers Row. You know, the people who were, you know, the big reporters at the time really took her under their wing. But you know, she talked about the moments where she'd almost forgotten how horrible it felt to be shut out. And she talked about 2 games in particular where she just assumed that she'd had access. She'd basically been given access in all these situations, and all of a sudden, for the first time, when she was forced to sort of sit up alone in the stadium and wait for everybody to come out, and knowing at that point there would be no more stories because everything was happening in the locker room with the other writers, and begging, basically, another reporter to feed her some lines so she could file her story. You know, that's an incredibly demoralizing moment, because that's where you're basically saying to someone, you
are not equal.
Yeah.
You're not equal.
Yeah.
And that, my day at the Masters, I remember being like flabbergasted and then so angry. And like I said, Bill Plaschke, who's a big columnist from the LA Times, happened to be right ahead of me, and he said, I'll get everything in there, try to figure this out, I'll get you everything in there. And then I was thinking, I remember, you know what, I'm gonna go find something else. Like I went back outside hoping maybe I'd find like Rory's family or something different that would say, you know, shut me out of there, you know, I'll go find something else instead. And unfortunately, you know, there was nothing out there. But yeah, it's a very, it's almost a shocking feeling, especially now, because we don't expect it maybe. But even back then, who expects that to just, you can't go in there because you're a woman.
Yeah.
I mean, that just.
But yeah, and I think
It's a terrible
the
thing to
emotion of
hear.
it, it's Leslie in many ways has
Yeah.
a great ability to put that stuff behind her. I think that's why people like working with
Yeah.
her, because she's sort of like, she was like a kid sister for a lot of people when she was in her early career. And then she became very politic at sort of playing things well, and she really didn't harbor any sort of resentments.
Well, it's
But yeah.
interesting that you mentioned that, because then we have the juxtaposition of somebody like Lisa Olson, who was
Yes.
harassed in the New England Patriots locker room. Those of you who saw the movie, that was 1990.
Yeah.
And to this day, it sounds, I mean, you approached her to participate,
She
right? And she
refused.
was,
Yeah.
it's just something she doesn't want to talk about? Is that the best way to put
Lisa
it?
Olson had death threats. I mean, she had people who, you know, were incredibly vengeful. It was a very peculiar, thinking back, this was 1990, to think that there was that visceral response from the general public to her presence in a locker room. It just, I think she was so disturbed by it. She left the country. She went to Australia and reported for a while. There is an organization called Awesome, which is the Association of Women in Sports Media, that is, and it started out as a networking support group for women who were basically trading tales about, you know, access issues, you know, politic issues with editors, you know, looking for whatever support they could get. And they just honored Lisa at their convention this summer. And I know she came back for that. She's seen the film. She's fine with the film. She did not choose to participate. She really wanted to leave that behind.
Well, that's, yeah, and I just, having known Lisa, the unfortunate part, you know, it became, because of what Zeke Moat did, and it became such a sexually charged, which has, for anybody, let me tell you, who thinks that a locker room situation is somehow a sexual situation. They've just never been in a locker room. It's
Right.
just not. And to make that assumption does a disservice to both the athletes and the reporters who are in there. So, but that case took that awful turn, and it just turned so personally on her. And it's horrifying to think about, and exactly that she just she had to leave the country, and it makes me sick when I think about what she went through. So I think for her, yeah, just too painful an episode to revisit. But we all know what happened. You know, I mean, that's the thing. Like, it's been a teaching tool regardless. So
Did this lead to some female reporters leaving the profession?
No, I wouldn't say that it left people leaving. I think that it left a very bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. I think, and I can't believe I'm blanking on the case that followed almost within 6 months after Lisa Olson. You can help me remember this. It was also in baseball, and it was because there were no immediate fines in relation to the Zeke Moet, you know.
Well, there were, but they were never collected, right?
They were
Is that
never-
the
they were
story?
never
Yeah,
collected.
They never
It was all
followed
for
through.
show.
Yeah, exactly. But I can't believe I'm blanking on this. It was 6 months later, and it was unrelated. We actually tried to work it into the film, and it was just too hard. It was kind of a square peg in a round hole because everyone wanted to see if there was a direct relationship between what had happened in the Patriots locker room with Zeke Moet and Lisa Olson and what had happened 6 months later. And I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of this case. It'll come to me in a second. There were fines that were levied 6 months later in a very similar case where there was an outrageous response made by one of the managers in baseball. And it was tricky though because the circumstances were radically different because of how and where it happened. So we couldn't quite tie them together, but I do think that there was starting to be a cultural shift of accountability.
yeah, and I would say that anybody of my generation, I graduated from college in 1990, and I think anyone from that point forward, male and female, knew of what happened to Lisa and was sort of ready to defend anybody in the locker room who might have been treated that way. You know, I think it affected the industry a whole lot, even if it took a longer time to affect professional sports teams and maybe change their behaviors. It changed our awareness, and I think reminded that whole generation moving forward of journalists that, you know, it's still, the whole thing wasn't solved.
Examining the history and role of women on the sports beat is a complex subject. In our next program, we'll continue the discussion with our panelists looking at the challenges. Thanks to our panelists, Annie Sundberg and Tara Sullivan, and special thanks to Dave Kaplan at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center for hosting the panel. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@mail.montclair.edu, or you can call us at 973-655-5158. I'm Mark Rosenwig from all of us at Montclair State University. Thanks for watching Carpe Diem.